A pleasant day to each and everyone. Before we start, I would like to introduce myself. I am Sergeant Vianation Pirinya, Reserve Philippine Army. I do a course of Bachelor of Elementary Education, major in Enhanced General Education at PSU Santa Maria Campus. I am a registered professional teacher year 2019. My military schoolings are Advanced ROTC MS31 to 42 and ROTC Staff Procedures Training. Classroom rules: phone must be turned off or set in silent mode to avoid interruption during our session. Gaming is not allowed. You are instructed to pay attention. When nature calls, go to the restroom. If you feel sleepy, stand or do some exercise to stay alert. Safety precautions. If unexpected earthquake, please do the 3 safe rules: drop, cover, and hold on. In case of fire, immediately go to the fire exit. Military history and evolution. Lesson objectives. Enabling learning objectives. At the end of the lesson, the students should be able to relate knowledge of military history and evolution to the education of students, cadet, and discuss the role and use of military history in military professional development. References: Wikipedia, Early Roman Army, Wiki First Crusade, Wiki Grande Arm, Types of Military Forces in the Napoleonic Wars, Wiki Sun Tzu, American Civil War, Wiki World War I, Wiki World War II, Wiki Cold War, The World Book Encyclopedia, CI to CZ, Q to R, N to O, and P. Lesson scope: Early armies, World War II armies, Cold War armies, and contemporary armies. Attention! At the end of the lesson, you are expected to answer questions, so be attentive and take note. Early armies. Roman early armies. Army evolution. Early regal era. To 550 BC, Roman gentes, clans, or ethnic groups, consisting 306 cognate et solades, men and supporters. In 479 BC, at this time, it is likely that Roman warriors were unarmored, carrying only light shields and leather helmets. Under the Roman Republic, the army was made up only of citizens who owned land. These militiamen were simply raised as a levy, also known as legion. Legions are farmers and herders, and they had to pay for their own arms and armaments. The early Romans fought as hoplites, phalanx formation, a tactics of tight mass formation of men fighting with their shields and spears. Under the Roman Republic, the army was made up only of citizens who owned land, because Romans believed that property owners will risk everything in the republic just to protect their land and properties. Unlike sa mga landless people na wala namang pinaglalaban. As Rome began to fight wars overseas, it required more soldiers and they had to serve for longer periods. By the time about 20 BC, most soldiers were professionals whose training and discipline made the Roman army one of the greatest fighting forces in history. Roman soldiers did not only fight, they also built roads, aqueducts or waterway, walls and tunnels. Early Roman army dated 500 BC. There was no national Roman army, but a series of clan-based war bands. Meaning, binubuo ito ng mga angkan ng pamilya na siya ding nakikipaglaban. Although kakaunti pa lang ang bilang nila, the Roman infantry was extremely tactical and developed some of the most influential battle strategies to date, namely the phalanx formation, three lines formation, just like sa chessboard fashion, kung makikita ninyo. Heavy force with metal armor horses. Imperial Roman Army, 30 BC to AD 284, the military chain of command was relatively uniform across the empire. Establishment of Vixilia. Soldiers spent only a fraction of their lives on campaign o kaya labanan. Most of their time was spent on routine military duties such as training, patrolling, and maintenance of equipment, etc. So, the first picture, the Roman soldier wearing hoplite. And then the second figure is the hoplite phalanx formation. So the military tactics of the Roman army, ang tactics ng Roman ay impluensya ng successful Greek army. The phalanx is used as a combat formation. Sa formation na ito ay dikit-dikit. Kung makikita nyo sa picture, ang mga sundalo to protect the man on his left. The phalanx formation ay mahirap tibagin. Hindi lang ito ginagamit to protect but also to push the enemy soldiers to the ground or to make them break ranks. Ang phalanx ay ginagamit ng daang taon or ginamit daang taon. However, hindi ito pwedeng gamitin sa fast-moving combat. So, the Roman army introduced the new system of organized infantry composing veletes, hastati, principes, and triarii. Ang veletes ay mga kabataang lalaki na walang karanasan sa labanan. Sila ang nasa front line. At ang main task nila ay to make early attacks on the enemy. After nun ay pupunta ang mga veletes sa likod. So, ang nasa harap na or front line ay mga hastati who will throw javelin to the enemy o kaya yung spears. Kung makikita ninyo yung spears dyan, yan yung mga hawak ng mga hastati. If the attempt is unsuccessful, magpapalikod yung mga hastati and it was now the turn of the principes to attack. The principes were the best soldiers. This point ay exhausted na ang kalaban. However, if the principes were unsuccessful, the last group, the triarii, would be brought forward. When the enemy retreated, the Roman cavalry would be called into action who will hunt down the enemy who fled from battlefield. So, kinukonsider ng mga Roman ang lugar ng labanan because Romans preferred to be in a higher position than the enemy. The Romans were extremely good at siege tactics. Roman engineers developed several different devices that could throw stones and javelins in long distances also.
2,000 years ago, the Roman army is the best equipped army in the world. While the architects have mastered the art of manipulating stone and concrete, military engineers have fashioned metal and wood to create devastating weapons of war. The Roman foot soldier's main weapon is a fearsome sword called a gladius, a double-edged blade about 18 inches long with a sharp point. It was used for stabbing and thrusting rather than slashing. But if a sword could be deadly at close quarters, their spear, called a pilum, could kill from a distance. It can be thrown with lethal accuracy around 100 feet.
The pilum's designed basically to kill. It's designed to pierce people, to pierce armor, to pierce their shields.
The pilum has a 6-foot-long wooden shaft, topped with a 2-foot-long iron shank. The tip of the shank was triangular and would have been difficult to remove once it impaled the enemy. The drawback of any javelin-type weapon is that the enemy may pick it up and throw it back. But Roman military scientists employ the latest metal-making technology to protect their men. The iron tip of the pilum is tempered through rapid heating and cooling, making it hard and strong. The shaft is untempered, leaving it soft. Striking a shield, the pilum's strong tip penetrates. but the soft shaft bends, making it useless for the enemy to throw it back at the Romans. Protecting your soldiers from injury is just as important as arming them for attack. Early Roman soldiers wear chainmail called lorica hamata. Vertical rows of solid washer-like rings made from bronze or iron are linked to riveted rings that run horizontally. It does have its flaws. It is very heavy, weighing around 33 pounds. And enemy arrows can penetrate between the rings to injure the wearer. Weapons reconstruction expert Ben Gilles studies the impact of Roman weapons.
So it literally explodes through the links and makes its own way.
Roman armorers come up with a far superior form of protection. Articulated plate armor called lorica segmentata, made from a series of overlapping iron plates joined together by leather straps. It's as flexible as chainmail, but 1/3 lighter. The protective shoulder and body pads worn by football players work in much the same way. The light segmented sections on the shoulders and chest allow movement, but spread the impact of a heavy blow around the body. The lorica segmentata is built to withstand an enemy arrow.
Well, it went in, only about that far.
The arrow may have made a dent, but the armor saves its wearer from serious injury. And if the Romans' weaponry has a modern feel, then so do the tactics they use. Some can still be seen today on the streets of New York. January 31st, 2002. Facing demonstrations against the World Trade Organization, the New York police defend themselves with the latest body armor and high-tech protection. But this use of shields is remarkably similar to something 2,000 years ago. The Roman legions know exactly how to fight heavily armed foes. They use the testudo, Latin for tortoise. Legionnaires bunch together and lock their shields in formation to create a large protective screen. A formation as effective in attack as it is in defense. The soldiers use a large curved shield, which is made from another modern-sounding material, plywood.
Plywood's very easy to make. You just take a few layers of wood and glue them together with the grain at 90 degrees to each other on the different layers. And that provides a protection that's fairly firm, but that is still a little bit flexible. And that's how they're able to produce these curved shields.
Crusade armies. Crusade were Christian military expeditions to recapture the Holy Land where Jesus had lived from Muslims. The Crusades began shortly before AD 1100 and lasted 1300. The word crusade comes from the Latin word crus, meaning cross. To take the cross meant to become a crusader. Christians were arose to organize the crusades primarily by religious faith, but the expeditions also were part of the larger effort by Europeans to increase their power, territory, and riches. First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, led by Peter and Hermit, and finally arrived at Jerusalem in the summer of 1099 and captured the city after 6 weeks of fighting. Before finally arriving, the First Crusade faced many challenges. These people were poorly trained and poorly equipped for fighting. Few reached their goal, some starved at namatay naman ang iba sa kamay ng mga Eastern Europeans. Then, pinatay naman ng mga Turks ang iba sa mga nakatawid sa Asia Minor. After capturing the city, most of the Crusaders then returned home, and those who stayed founded a group called Latin States of the Crusaders. Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, The dissociation of King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany led the defeat of the Second Crusade. Too few crusaders remained to defend the Holy Land. King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany led armies into Asia Minor, but they did not cooperate with each other and the Turks defeated them. So this results na ma-encourage ang mga Muslims na atakihin ulit ang mga Christians. Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192. Quarrels among other rulers kept the Crusades from complete success. The Third Crusade were launched to get back the conquered Holy Land. Only Tyre, Tripolis, and Antioch remained in Christian hands. King Richard I led the crusade, a great warrior, and defeated Saladin, the Muslims' leader, in several battles and recaptured Acre, or the North Jerusalem. Fourth Crusade, 1201 to 1204. This Fourth Crusade was not a crusade against Muslims at all. It was an expedition for economic and political gain. The Fourth Crusade ay ang huling seryosong expedition laban sa mga Muslim. Hinikayat ni Pope Innocent III ang maraming mayayaman at tanyag na Pranses na makilahok sa expedition. Nakipagtawaran ng mga Crusaders sa mga Venetians na sumakay sila sa barko upang makarating sa Eastern Mediterranean. Pero nung nakarating sila sa Venice, ay hindi sila makapagbayad. So nakipag-deal naman ang mga Venetians sa mga Crusaders na tulungan silang atakihin ang Byzantine Empire. Ang Crusaders never reached the Holy Land because of the gains na nakamit na nila. Fifth Crusade, dated 1217 to 1221, the Christians captured the town of Demacia at the mouth of the Nile River in Egypt. Sixth Crusade, 1228 to 1229, Emperor Frederick II won without a battle. He got the Muslims to give Jerusalem to Christians. Seventh Crusade, 1248 to 1254, also known as the Fall of Jerusalem. Then, King Louis IX of France took Demacia without a fight, ngunit napaligiran at nahuli ng mga Turks ang mga Crusaders. Pinalaya nila si Louis at mga noblemen after na makapagbigay ng malaking bayad para sa ransom nila ang mga Kristiyano. As revenge, binuo ni Louis ang Eighth Crusade. Ngunit dahil sa katandaan at sakit ay namatay siya, that leads his army to retreat. So, ito yung 8th Crusade dated 1270, retreat. Next, the Children's Crusade, 1212. So, young boys and girls steered by religious fervor to go to Holy Land. It is a failed mission. This was not important history, pero naging interesado ang mga tao dito after hundreds of years because of the tragic story. There are two armies of them, one from France and one from Germany. None of the children reached the Holy Land. Maraming namatay sa gutom, lamig, at iba pang hirap just to reach the Holy Land. Ang iba ay nalunod sa dagat dahil sa unos or ibinenta bilang alipin sa mga Muslims, at sad to say, ni isa ay wala nang nakabalik sa kanilang mga tahanan. So, this is an example of the picture of the Crusaders. During the Crusades, the Europeans learned how to make better ships and maps, and they learned new ways to make war.
The Crusades were military campaigns waged by Western European Christians during the Middle Ages for the defense and expansion of Christendom. What made a crusade distinct was that warriors involved in the fighting received spiritual merit, usually a plenary indulgence granted by the Pope. A crusade was considered by Western European Christians to be a holy act, an act of sacrifice and piety for the love of Christ. 4 centuries before the beginning of the Crusades, the first Muslim armies swept out of Arabia to conquer Palestine, Syria, Mesopotamia, Egypt, North Africa, and Spain, some 2/3 of the Christian world. Between the 7th and 11th centuries, Christians fought wars against Muslims to prevent them from making further conquests into Christian territory, or to reconquer what had already been captured. In Spain, Christian kingdoms waged wars to recapture their homeland from the Arabs, while the Byzantine Empire in the east was engaged in centuries of war with the Muslims for control of Anatolia and other regions. In the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks, recent converts to Islam, swept through Syria and Palestine. In 1071, they defeated the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert, conquering almost all of Anatolia. In response, Pope Urban II called the First Crusade, asking knights from all over Europe to band together and push back the Seljuks. Over the 12th and 13th centuries, the popes called more crusades to the Holy Land and also called for crusades in Spain to help push back the Muslim powers. Crusades against Muslims were not called with the intention of converting them to Christianity. Rather, they were called to regain control of territory that had been previously Christian but had fallen to Muslim armies. Jerusalem had been conquered by the Muslims in 637 and was considered particularly important to Western Christians since it was the site of Christ's crucifixion. Indeed, Jerusalem was revered as the holiest site in the Christian cosmos, and it was particularly important to Western Europeans that it be brought again under Christian rule. When in the 11th century, news arrived that Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem were being harassed and killed by the Seljuk Turks, this fact alone inspired many knights to join the First Crusade. Although the Crusades were called to reclaim lands, greed was not a primary motivation. Professor Jonathan Riley Smith, the world's foremost expert on Crusades history, has proven that crusading was incredibly dangerous and expensive, and that virtually none of the knights who went could expect to gain wealth. Indeed, they often bankrupted themselves crusading. The primary motivation for crusading was spiritual, with the knights joining because they believed that they were doing God's work by fighting to protect Christian pilgrims and to reclaim holy sites like Jerusalem, and that involving themselves in a crusade would win them spiritual merit. The Crusades to the Holy Land saw many failures but also many successes. The First Crusade and the Third Crusade, for example, were both very successful, though ultimately later, at the close of the 13th century, the last Crusader holdings in Syria and Palestine would be captured by the Muslim Mamluk Empire. However, the Crusades in Spain achieved lasting victory, with the whole of Spain being ultimately recaptured by the Christians. Later Crusades would also be called against the Ottoman Turks, such as the Crusade of Lepanto in 1571. If you want to learn more about the Crusades, subscribe to this channel, Real Crusades History. We present regular videos and podcasts on the Crusades. Thanks for watching. My new book, Why Does the Heathen Rage?, a novel of the Crusades set during the reign of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, is now available in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. Please click on the link in the About box of this video to get your copy. Also, if you would like to support Real Crusades history by offering a donation, you will find a PayPal donate link in the About box of this video. Thank you.
Napoleonic War. Napoleon Bonaparte, or Napoleon I, 1769 to 1821, crowned himself Emperor of the French. He was the greatest military genius of his time. Napoleon had an unimpressive appearance, but he carried himself well. His courage and short stature led to his early nickname of Le Petit Caporal or Little Corporal. His soldiers adored him. He personally directed complicated military maneuvers and at the same time controlled France's press, police system, foreign policy, and its home government. He pioneered new strategy and tactics and became one of the great military commanders in history. Pinatunayan din ni Napoleon Bonaparte na isa siyang talentadong administrator. He developed a principle of war that formed the basis of his future campaigns. He learned to seek a weak point in the enemy's line and throw all his strength against it at the decisive hour of battle. With that point broken or weakened, the enemy collapsed. So, this is the first victories of Napoleon. Triumphs in Italy. Napoleon arrived in Nice, France in March 1796. He found his army there, poorly fed and clothed. He promised his men everything, and they believed him. After a few weeks, he conquered Milan. Napoleon forced Naples, Parma, and Modena to seek peace. His armies then crushed the Austrians. Austria made peace in the Treaty of Campo Formio. Napoleon, now a national hero, returning glory to Paris. Next is Egypt invaded. Some men in the Directory feared, envied, and distrusted the young hero. Napoleon had great prestige in the army and his men idolized him. Napoleon's 35,000 men expedition reached Alexandria in July 1798. He defeated Mamelukes within sight of the Egyptian pyramids. Next is the first consul of France. In Paris, he and his followers seized power in a bold move called the Coup d'etat of 18th Brumaire in November 9, 1799. Napoleon abolished the Directory and set up new government called the Consulate. He became the first consul. He codified and revised the French laws that today Code Napoleon remains the basis of French law. Napoleon set up the Bank of France, founded the Legion of Honor to honor soldiers and civilians who had made contributions to France. Next, the Napoleonic Empire. War against Austria. Napoleon ruled France with wisdom and vigor, but he found it difficult to settle down peacetime government. At naisipan niyang magplano ng pananakop, Napoleon planned to strike a quick blow at his old enemy. In Athens, his army clashed with the Austrians at Marengo in June, and it turned into a victory. Austria agreed to sign a peace treaty on February 9, 1801 at Lunéville. Na-enjoy ng France ang 10 years na katahimikan, ngunit hindi matanggal sa isipan ni Napoleon na baka kalabanin siya ng Britanya, kaya ibinenta ni Napoleon ang Louisiana sa Estados Unidos upang makalikom ng malaking halaga upang mapaghandaan nito ang Britanya. So, hindi nagtagal, on May 16, Britain declared war on France. Napoleon prepared to invade the British Isles. Next, crowned emperor. The French people in 1802 had voted Napoleon the title First Consul for life, but Napoleon was not satisfied. In May 1804, the French Senate voted him the title of Emperor. The coronation took place at Notre Dame Cathedral on December 2. habang inihanda ng Papa or Pope ang pagkorona sa kanya, ay ito yung nakakatawang part. Agad na kinuha ni Napoleon ang korona at isinuot niya ito sa kanyang ulo. So, hindi siya nakapag-antay. He showed na nanalo siya sa karapatang maangkin ito. Napoleon is probably the most famous for his military achievements. He set up a strong central government, reorganized education system, founded imperial university, and appointed officers in different departments. Next, dominates Europe. In 1805, Austria, Russia, and Sweden joined Britain in a new coalition against France and Spain. Emperor Napoleon I abandoned plans to invade Britain. On December 2, he smashed the Austrian and Russian armies at Austerlitz in one of his most brilliant victories. Later that month, Austria signed the Peace of Pressburg, and Russia stopped fighting. So Napoleon uses column formation, narrow and long form suited for quick maneuvers, line formation, allowing the unit to control wider portion, and the infantry square, and the mix of line and column formation. Pero minsan lang ito ginagamit kasi hindi ito suited sa labanan.
The great mass of all armies were comprised of foot soldiers who invariably suffered the heaviest casualties and usually decided the outcome of battle. Infantry was not only the most numerous unit type during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic time, but also one of the most versatile and effective. It was capable of both ranged and hand-to-hand combat. It could be used in almost all terrain, and compared to cavalry and artillery, was also quite cheap. So let's take a look at infantry combat and tactics during the era of Napoleon. Basically, there were two types of infantry, although some authors note up to three. Now, the two types were the line infantry and the light infantry. Infantry units carried several different names depending on the nation which raised them. But generally, line infantry consists of any infantry formation known as Infanterie de Ligne, infantry, musketeers, grenadiers, or guards. Light infantry consists of any formation known as chasseurs, Jägers, Freiwillige Jägers, Pandors, Schützen, Infanterie Légère, or light infantry. The term Fusilier, unfortunately, can denote either. The line infantry was the regular infantry, fighting in the line of battle, in closed order formation, whereas light infantry usually fought in skirmish or open order formation. As you can see, there's a clear difference between closed order and open order formation. The closed order formation of the line infantry focused mainly on control, discipline, cadence marching, volley fire, and rigid maneuvers, whereas the light infantry was about initiative, flexibility, terrain-focused movement, individual fire, and cover. The main function of the line infantry was to hold and take ground, inflict damage on the enemy with volley fire, and force him from the battlefield with bayonet charges. It constituted the majority of the troops, whereas light infantry was more about harassing and disturbing the enemy, like provoking him to fire a volley early to waste ammunition or reduce temporarily the firepower of the unit, since the reloading time was rather long. Light infantry was also about exploiting opportunities yet avoid major confrontation. Light infantrymen hid behind rocks and bushes when they fought, and were used to harass the enemy line infantry as well as to screen their own. Light infantry could, if required, operate as line infantry, and depending on the nation, did so to greater or lesser degrees. To oversimplify it a bit, light infantry was about annoying the enemy and covering the flanks of the friendly line infantry. Yet in terms of equipment, besides the weapons, there were only minor differences. Of course, you need to keep in mind that it should be clearly understood that there are almost always exceptions to any rule one might establish for this period. That said, some words about the basic weapon of the infantry. This was the smoothbore flintlock musket, which had a rather large caliber by modern standard of around 17.7mm up to 19.3mm, depending on the respective weapon. For comparison, here is a Volvo 2 rifle and a contemporary US carbine, As you can see, both the calibers and lengths have been reduced quite significantly. Although some muskets were better than others, some authors note that the differences between the different muskets were quite small. One key limitation of the musket was its limited accuracy due to low muzzle velocity, large windage, no rifling, and limited training of the troops. Now a regular musket had a smoothbore barrel, whereas rifles were rifled. Although rifling made a shot more accurate, it had more drawbacks. One might wonder why rifles were not common on the battlefield. There were several reasons. First, they were significantly more expensive. In addition, they were slower to fire, as shown by Scharnhorst's study. They often required a mallet to pound the ball into position. They usually required better grades of powder, required custom manufactured balls, and fouled too easily. Thus, rifles were generally only given to light infantry, since for them accuracy was of greater importance than the rate of fire. Yet even there it was rare that an entire battalion was equipped with rifles. As such, they were often just issued improved smoothbore muskets. Now time to look at formations. These were and are important for various reasons. They influenced mobility and combat capabilities. Note that most of these formations were for battalion-sized units upwards. Yet due to size restrictions, I often use smaller units for illustration purposes. So let's look at some of the most important formations. At first is the line. It was well suited for firefights and also the base formation. This is also reflected by the name line infantry. Since the line infantry focused on mass and volley fire, it was the key to maximize the amount of firepower on a limited area. As such, these formations were rather dense. The line usually had a depth of 2 to 3 men. The French usually had a depth of 3, whereas the British used 2 men. Now for the French it is important to note that the third rank was not shooting over the heads of the men in front of them, instead they stepped to the side. Besides maximizing firepower, the line had several other strengths as well. Due to the lack of depth, artillery fire with round shots could inflict only minor damage from the front. Additionally, since the frontage was rather wide, the chances of outflanking were also reduced. Yet many of these aspects were weaknesses as well. For instance, the line was not really well suited for moving forward, since it was difficult to maintain the long stretched formation even in regular terrain. During combat, one key problem was the lack of depth. As such, it could be easily penetrated. Additionally, its flanks were unprotected. This meant that attacks from the side, especially by cavalry, could have devastating results. At Albuera, Colbon's brigade deployed in line was blinded by a sudden rain squall, and when it lifted, 2 French light cavalry regiments fell on its flanks. Within 5 minutes, 3 of its battalions, lacking time to form squares, were annihilated. Out of a total of 80 officers and 1,568 men, 1,248 were dead, wounded, or captured. The other key formation that addressed several of the weaknesses of the line was the column. The column was ideally suited for marching and advancing, in which even untrained troops could easily remain in formation. Marching columns, as distinct from attack columns, were used to bring troops into range. The resulting depth and cohesion of the column provided a natural defense against cavalry attacks. Due to its mass, the column was well suited for charges or holding the ground against enemy advances. The main weaknesses of the column were its vulnerability to artillery fire and skirmishers due to the depth. Additionally, only a fraction of the theoretical firepower of a unit in column could be brought into action. Due to the various weaknesses and strengths of the line in column, it was thus a common approach to use the column to get into range and deploy into a line to conduct the firefight. Hence, key maneuvers on the battlefields were to deploy from column into line or vice versa. Of course, there was also the possibility to combine line formations with column formations and also open order formations. This was called the mixed order formation that was used extensively by Napoleon. This formation provided significant firepower from the battalion in line and at the same time allowed for shock from the columns, while also protecting the vulnerable flanks of the battalion in line. But this formation required a high level of training and proficiency, as detailed in the Règlement du Roi Haut 1791. The next formation, like many of you know from a computer game, it is the square. Now Nosworthy has a very interesting note here on the squares. A variety of formations, all with the distinguishing characteristics of being either rectangular or square in shape. These were defensive formations used to protect infantry from cavalry attacking the flank or rear. Although most drill booklets call for cavalry squares, this was commonly recognized as being less than useless, and wasn't used in practice. Note that some other authors don't dismiss the square at all or less strongly. Additionally, it also depends on the circumstances. For instance, Napoleon in Egypt had a severe lack of cavalry, as such he used large hollow square formations as pointed out by Nosworthy. Note there existed various variations of the square, and again the unit size has to be taken into account as well. As such, I'm not entirely sure how valid Nosworthy's comment is. Now, there are various issues with the square that are less apparently initially. First, it was almost a passive formation since movement was very limited. On top of that, maneuvering into a square formation was difficult and required precise timing. As such, the unit could be even more vulnerable than before. At the same time, the firepower of the unit was severely reduced, so if enemy infantry was close by, this was a major weakness. And finally, and worst of all, squares constituted prime targets for artillery. Now let's look at some basic.
Sun Tzu was a Chinese general, military strategist, writer, and philosopher who lived in the Eastern Zhou period of ancient China. Sun Tzu is traditionally credited as the author of The Art of War, an influential work of military strategy that has affected both Western and East Asian philosophy and military thinking. His works focus much more on alternatives to battle, such as stratagem, delay, and use of spies, and alternatives to war itself, the making and keeping of alliances, the uses of deceit, and a willingness to submit, at least temporarily, to more powerful foes. Sun Tzu is revered in Chinese and East Asian culture as a legendary historical and military figure. Sun Tzu, circa 500 BC. So please take note of this. The Art of War is divided into 13 chapters. The Art of War is divided into 13 chapters. Number 1, laying plans or the calculations. Number 1, laying plans or the calculations. Explores the 5 fundamental factors: the way, seasons, terrain, leadership, and management. Number 2, waging war. Number 2, waging war. This section advises that successful military campaigns require limiting the cost of competition and conflict. Number 3, the plan of attack. Number 3, the plan of attack. The source of strength is unity, not size. Number 4, tactical dispositions. Number 4, tactical dispositions. It teaches commanders the importance of recognizing strategic opportunities and teaches not to create opportunities for the enemy. Number 5, use of energy or strategic military power. Number 5, use of energy, strategic military power. The use of creativity and timing. Number 6, weak and strong points. Weak and strong points. How to have opportunity in the weakness of the enemy. Number 7, maneuvering an army. Number 7, maneuvering an army. Explains the danger of direct conflict and how to win those confrontations. Number 8, variation of tactics. 8, variation of tactics, response for flexibility to shift circumstances successfully. Number 9, the army on the march. 9, the army on the march, evaluating enemy's territory. Number 10, classification of terrain. 10, classification of terrain. Study the general areas of resistance, just like distance, dangers, and barriers. Number 11, the 9 situations. Number 11, the 9 situations. Successful navigation. Number 12, attack by fire. 12, attack by fire. Uses of weapons and the advantage of environment during attack. Number 13, use of spies. 13, use of spies. Importance of information and types of intelligence.
In the age of bloody civil war, 2,500 years ago, a Chinese military commander, strategist and philosopher emerged. His name? Sun Tzu. After successfully defending the state of Wu against its neighbour Chu to the west, a book formerly known as Master Sun's Military Methods was born, which has later become known as The Art of War. The Art of War is the most influential treatise on war ever written, consisting of 13 chapters, each of which is devoted to one aspect of warfare. It has shaped the way in which conflicts have been fought for thousands of years, from the Japanese samurai to the Napoleonic War. Not only has the book influenced military commanders and generals all over the world, it has had resounding effects on politics, sports, and business to this day. The art of war is of vital importance to the state. It's a matter of life and death, a road either to safety or to ruin. Hence it's a subject of inquiry which can on no account be neglected. Sun Tzu has a holistic philosophy that if you follow correctly and study thoroughly, you will be victorious. Sun Tzu says, "Avoid what is strong and strike at what is weak." Sun Tzu is a strong believer that winning the war with as little unnecessary combat as possible is the key to true victory. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting, and the key to doing so is to know your enemy well. If your opponent is arrogant, pretend to be weak, so he will underestimate you. If he was relaxing, attack and give him no rest. If his forces are united, separate them. Sun Tzu is essentially saying that if you know your opponent's weaknesses and how to exploit them, you will never lose.
So at dawn, the hopeless Athenians do the unthinkable. They attack. They attack the weary Persians as they disembark their ships on shaky legs after a month at sea. They attack before they can establish their war camp and supply their soldiers.
Sun Tzu says, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. During the mid-1960s, a war took place between the North Vietnamese Communists and the United States of America. Instead of confronting the Americans head-on, the Viet Cong had a different idea in mind. They used unconventional guerrilla warfare tactics, which included hit-and-run strategies. This proved very effective against the much larger military of the Americans. It's more important to outthink your enemy than to outfight him. The Viet Cong forces were inferior to the Americans in both man and firepower, so guerrilla warfare tactics allowed them to inflict significant damage while keeping their casualties to a minimum. They also had unparalleled knowledge of the terrain. This included a vast network of underground tunnels, allowing them to evade carpet bombing and escape the enemy. The terrain was also laced with various booby traps and landmines. Even though the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese were heavily out-armed by the American superpower, they were still able to defeat them as they truly understood Sun Tzu's philosophy. All warfare is based on deception. Hence, when we are able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must appear inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near. This philosophy can be seen in the World War II invasion of Normandy, known as D-Day. The British created several fictional units of troops stationed in Scotland who were ready to invade Europe through its northern regions, in particular Scandinavia. They then used several misinformation techniques to persuade Hitler that 350,000 of these troops were primed to attack. Radio chatter in Scotland lit up with talks of these troops preparing for an overseas assault, and many of these transmissions were made easily interceptable. Allied spies who had been able to infiltrate the Germans reported these developments as well, reinforcing their legitimacy. These spies also took photographs of planes and tanks posed for invasion, but these were actually blow-up models in most cases. All this caused dozens of German divisions to go up to bogus locations and wait for an imaginary army to show up, whilst important battles were fought elsewhere. This method of dividing enemy forces was also employed to a greater extent on D-Day itself. Soviet forces kept around 1 million of the German forces busy on the Eastern Front, whilst the Allied invasion occurred on the Western Front. This tactic of dividing the enemy is one of Sun Tzu's key philosophies and allowed the Allies to achieve victory and eventually win the war.
American Civil War. The American Civil War was a civil war in the United States from 1861 to 1865, fought between northern states loyal to the Union and southern states that had seceded to form the Confederate States of America. The Civil War began as a result of the unresolved controversy of the enslavement of black people and its disputed continuance. War broke out in April 1861 when secessionist forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina, just over a month after Abraham Lincoln had been inaugurated as the President of the United States. The loyalists of the Union in the North, which also included some geographically western and southern states, proclaimed support for the Constitution. They faced secessionists of the Confederate States in the South who advocated for states' rights to uphold slavery. So this is an example of a civil war. So ito, kung makikita ninyo, is face-to-face sila. And they are in the line formation at naglalabanan talaga sila ng malapitan. So marami ring natatalo noong Civil War, maraming namamatay kasi nga hindi pa professional or hindi well trained ang mga civil o mga nakikipaglaban na tao ng mamamayan ng Amerika.
Civil War soldiers sometimes fought on mountains, sometimes they fought in the woods, they fought along rivers and streams, but most often they fought in places like this, open fields. And if you've seen a Civil War movie, or you've read about the Civil War, or been to a reenactment, you know that soldiers fought in long lines of battle, shoulder to shoulder, and nothing could look stupider to us now. But these soldiers didn't have a death wish. It's not that they weren't smart, they were using the most modern military tactics they had available to them. But the problem is that there were advancements in weaponry that made some of those tactics obsolete. This is not unique. This happens again and again. After every war, you reevaluate and you change those tactics in the following war. The invention I'm talking about more than anything else is the widespread use of rifling. Before the Civil War, guns, handheld guns, fired round bullets, and they could shoot 50 to 100 yards accurately. But suddenly, they're going to have a rifled musket be more common that fires these things, mini balls. This is a Union mini ball, most commonly because it has 3 rings. This one is a Confederate mini ball. It has 2 rings. This isn't absolute, but this is typically how they went. And these things not only spin as they leave the barrel because of grooves in the gun barrel called rifling, but they are also concave inside, which allow the bullet to actually expand and take to the grooves better. And then it spirals as it leaves the gun, and like a spiral football, these bullets will fly farther and more accurately. And suddenly, you can fire these things 250, 300, 350 yards more accurately. And what that says is that your enemy is going to get off a lot more shots at you when you're crossing that field toward them. Before the Civil War, you could get up pretty close to your enemy, make a final charge, and then overrun the position after they fired a shot or maybe two. That's not the case in the Civil War. When people tell me that Civil War soldiers had a death wish or weren't that intelligent, I ask them what they would have done. And the most common answer I get is they say, well, I would send 200 guys over here, and then 50 guys over there, and then 300 guys this way, and then 40 more this way, and 100 over in that direction. That doesn't work. All your enemy would do is shoot the first 200, reload, shoot the next 50, reload, shoot the next 100, reload, shoot the next 200, and so on. In the Civil War, it's important to march up to your enemy to deliver a concentrated fire at once. If you march up with 1,000 soldiers, maybe 100 or 200 of them could be killed or wounded in that first volley, but you still have 800 or 900 left to deliver a concentrated fire against your enemy. These are also large armies, huge armies, operating without walkie-talkies or cell phones, so it's very hard to keep them together. Marching shoulder to shoulder, waving flags, blowing bugles are some of the ways where you communicated with these troops in order to keep them moving in the battle. Imagine a large-scale battle and a huge football stadium emptying and trying to control everybody in that, trying to get them to do what you want them to do to move your army around. Very, very difficult. And the frontal movements, these get there first with the most men, bring the greatest amount of firepower as you can against your enemy, was a very important part of the Civil War. So while attacking frontally was still an important part of the Civil War, you had to get at your enemy somehow. One of the ways that you could get at your enemy, which was effective then and is effective now, is of course via flanking. Instead of attacking your enemy straight on, you can get around the end of their line. When you get around the end of their line, they're in big trouble, because if they try to fire in this direction, all their friends are in the way. Whereas if I fire from over here, I can't miss. My guys, if they don't hit him, he'll hit him or him or him or him or him. That is called raking the line or enfilade. And if you are flanked, you have two choices: run away or get shot. And despite what some people think, these soldiers did not have a death wish, so they would simply fall back and try to take up a stronger position where they could actually face their enemy. Flanking is a very effective maneuver, and it's one of many used throughout the Civil War to try to get at your enemy, to try to gain an advantage over them.
Colonist. History of colonialism. Ancient colonialism. The Roman Empire was the greatest colonial empire of ancient times. Early European colonialism. In the 14th, Portugal and Spain began to send explorers in search of sea routes to India and the Far East, West Africa, and Southeast Asia. Later colonialism. The 13 colonies gained independence from England in the Revolutionary War, 1775-1783. Belgium, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Portugal, and Spain divided almost all Africa among themselves. United States and Japan acquired Philippines after the colonialism of Spanish. Japan, an empire, includes a number of colonies. Colonialism today. France, Great Britain, Portugal, Spain, and other nations still govern a few overseas areas. The United States governs a number of overseas areas, including American Samoa, Guam, and various other Pacific islands, such as Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Philippines under colonialism. So let's focus in the Philippines. Spanish colonial period dated 1565 to 1898. The Spanish settlement and rule began in 1521. A Spanish expedition led by Ferdinand Magellan, who arrived in the Philippines. So, hindi sinasadya na ma-discover ni Magellan ang Philippines, kasi ang original na pupuntahan niya is the Spice Island. So, namatay si Magellan sa labanan sa kamay ng mga native warriors led by Dato Lapu-Lapu. Because of this, his fleet departed for Spain, and this caused another group of Spanish explorers led by General Miguel Lopez de Legazpi claimed the islands for Spain at na-establish ang settlement ng Spanya dito sa Pilipinas way back 1565. The Spaniards ruled the Philippines under a strong central government. Then, noong lumakas na ang ekonomiya ng bansa, ang mga mayamang Pilipino ay nagumpisang ipinadala ang kanilang mga anak sa mga tanyag na university sa Manila and even to Europe. After this, young people returned home ay nagumpisa silang mag-seek ng political and social freedom from Spain. An early leader in the freedom movement was Jose Rizal, who was a physician. Andres Bonifacio, an office clerk, also known as the Ama ng Katipunan. Emilio Aguinaldo, a local chief of the Katipunan, and many other revolutionary leaders followed them. Next is the American colonial period dated 1899 to 1941. After defeating Spaniards, the United States and Spain signed a peace treaty in December 1898. Under the treaty, the United States gained possession of the Philippines and paid Spain worth $20 million for the islands. In 1901, the United States set up a colonial government in the Philippines during the period of American rule. The use of English spread rapidly throughout the islands. During the early 19th, the United States began to allow Filipinos to hold positions in the government. Next is the Japanese occupation dated 1942 to 1945 and also the start of World War II. Japanese control on December 7, 1941. Japanese planes bombed Pearl Harbor, ang US Naval Base sa Hawaii. The United States entered World War II the next day. On December 10, Japanese troops invaded the Philippines. Nagsama naman ang pwersa ng mga Amerikano at Pilipino na pinangunahan ni General Douglas MacArthur hanggang 1942. Iniwan ni General MacArthur ang Pilipinas and leave the statement, "I shall return." Maraming Amerikano at sundalo ang ikinilong, ginutom, namatay at pinahirapan, but others escaped to the mountains and continued to resist the Japanese throughout the war. MacArthur returned to the Philippines with additional troops in October 1944 and defeated the Japanese several months later. Naapektuhan ng sobra ang ekonomiya ng Pilipinas at nagkaroon ng malawakang pinsala sa mga infrastruktura, lalo na sa Kalakhang, Maynila dahil sa digmaan. The United States granted Philippines complete independence on July 4, 1946. So, ito yung mga iba't ibang larawan ng Spanish colonial period, American colonial period, and Japanese occupation. Cold War. The struggle between the communist nations and democratic nations that began after World War II. The aftermath of World War II shifted the global balance of power and created a bipolar world led by two competing superpowers, the United States, which is the US, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, called the USSR. So, they call this global competition the Cold War. Cold War is the term used to describe the struggle between the communist nations and democratic nations that began after World War II. This struggle was called the Cold War because it did not lead to fighting or hot war like World War. Noong 1947, naging aware ang United States sa banta ng paglawak ng Russian Communist. Ang secret infiltration din ng komunista ay nakaalarma sa maraming Amerikano. Dito nabuo ang two great blocks. When you say blocks, meaning group of nations. Pag sinabing blocks, group of nations. The United States led the free world nations. Ito ang Canada, France, Great Britain, West Germany, Japan, Philippines at iba pang mga bansa ng Western Europe at Latin America. Ang Russia naman ang namumuno sa communist bloc na binubuo ng China mula noong 1949 at iba pang mga komunistang bansa ng Eastern Europe. The communist bloc was often called the East at ang Free World Bloc naman ang tinatawag na West. May tinatawag namang neutral nations. Ulitin ko, neutral nations. Ibig sabihin, ito yung mga ayaw makisawsaw sa awayan. Ito ay mga bansang India, Sweden, Switzerland, Indonesia, Cambodia, at most of the African states. So, isa din sila na hindi nakikijoin sa UN tuwing nagkakaroon ng, kunwari, just like in South Korea, nangailangan sila ng UN forces, nangailangan sila ng reinforcement ng ibang mga bansa. Pero itong mga bansang ito, which is the neutral nations, hindi sila nakikibahagi sa mga world war kasi ayaw nila ng gulo or ayaw nila ng may pinapanigan sila. During the late 1940s and 1950s, the Cold War became increasingly tense. Each side ay nag-akusahan na gusto ng bawat party na magkaroon ng dominasyon at pamamahala sa buong mundo. Each side believed its political and economic systems were better than the others. Each strengthened its armed forces. Both sides viewed the Cold War as a dispute between right and wrong. Fear grew among all peoples that a local conflict would touch a third world war that might destroy humanity. So, there are three key features define the Cold War. Number one is the nuclear war threat. So, hanggang ngayon, ang Democratic at Communist ay lagi pa ring nagbabangayan at nagbababala about sa nuclear bombing, if you are aware of that. Lalong-lalo na ang North Korea and America na ikinababahala ng mamamayan ng iba't ibang bansa na pwedeng maihalintulad sa Hiroshima na ikinamatay ng 80,000 people. Iba pa ang mga namatay dahil sa radiation na dulot ng atomic bomb. Another is the Nagasaki that immediately killed 40,000 people. Number two is the competition over allegiance. Nakikipagkompetensya sa pagkuha or pag-gain ng loyalty sa mga bagong independent na bansa. Number three, military economic support. Dahil sa pagiging advanced at dominant ng United States, sa pagpapakita nito ng global military dominance dahil sa pagbomba ng atomic bomb sa Japan sa Hiroshima, Nagasaki upang tigilan ang digmaan, naisipan rin ng USSR na gumawa ng nuclear technology para i-discourage ang Amerika sa pagiging agresibo nito. The US also made profits in selling high-standard weapons and supplies to the Allied forces.
Leadership brings out the best in us. We become the best versions of ourselves, leading by example. We learn to live with honor, take pride in our patriotism, and answer the call of duty. A leader doesn't just strive to make a living, but aspires to make a difference. We are trained to let fear be but a precursor to valor, and to thrive and triumph in the face of fear is what it means to be a soldier. But first, we need to make a choice. We must desire to help others, liberate the oppressed, and be a champion of peace. We must choose to inspire a nation worth fighting for. It is a choice that gives a sense of purpose and lifts us to great heights. Destiny waits for no one, and the choice is yours to make. Don't wish. Become.
Contemporary armies. So when we say contemporary, it means modern armies. Okay, so the Philippine Army consists of 11 infantry divisions, 1 armored division, 1 combined arms brigade, 1 artillery regiment, 5 engineering brigades, 1 aviation regiment, and 7 combat support units which are spread throughout the Philippine archipelago. So, ngayon, ibang-iba na rin ang warfare ngayon at mas pinag-iisipan na ang mabuti ng magkabilang panig na dapat huwag padalos-dalos. And because of advancement ng technology ngayon, ito may mga iba't iba ng warfare na nabubuo. Ito ang aerial, asymmetric, biological na pinagtatalunan ng USA at China na ginagamit ang COVID-19 sa economic warfare. And then chemical warfare, electronic warfare. So, kailangan ngayon ng iba't ibang bansa ang mga skilled IT upang hindi mapasok ang database na naglalaban ng confidentiality and to assure the security of the state. Fourth generation warfare, ito naman yung ipinapaglaban ang ideology na nagkukos ng conflicts between civilians and combatants at naapektuhan rin ang politics. Land warfare, intelligence like propaganda, which is disinformation that aims to influence opinions and behavior of large numbers of people. Usong-uso rin ito ngayon sa Pilipinas. Next is the psychological warfare, information warfare, naval warfare. Kung mapapansin ninyo, ay very careful ang presidente natin sa mga magiging aksyon sa West Philippine Sea, lalong-lalo na ngayong may tinatawag na Chinese Coast Guard Law na naging mainit sa pahayagan dahil wala man lang pasabi ang China sa batas na ito. Next is the network-centric warfare, nuclear warfare, space warfare. Though wala pang nangyayaring ganito, pero maaari itong mangyari dahil kabi-kabila ng pagpapalipad ng mga spaceship or satellites, both Western and Eastern Bloc. The weapons that might include here is the orbital weaponry and the space weapons. Using satellites, this is the only science fiction pa lang, pero tinitignan din itong isang anggulo ng modern warfare. For 122 years, the Philippine Army served as the protector of the Filipinos and a key player of nation building. Today, the Philippine Army continues to innovate its forces and victor against all battles and threats to serve the people and secure the land. Warfare instruments of the Filipino forces continued to develop over time. Army Vision by 2028, a world-class army that is a source of national pride, and its Army Corps purpose, honor, patriotism, and duty. Summary. The military history of the past is a record of bravery, sacrifice, and undaunted persistence of every soldier. The AFP today is the mirror and the fruit of the past. Thus, the soldiers are peace-loving, partner in nation-building, competent, and more self-reliant core of men and women. The AFP of tomorrow is not only a protector of the state but an agent of peace and a partner in nation building for better Philippines. Citations: never to leave the ranks because of fear or to run away, but only to retrieve or grab a weapon, to kill an enemy or to rescue a comrade. It is part of the Roman oath. You must not fight too often with one enemy, or you will teach him all your art of war. By Napoleon Bonaparte. Appear weak when you are strong, and strong when you are weak. By Sun Tzu. Question. Assignment. If you are the president, what do you think is the solution to stop internal conflicts here in the Philippines? Next, how does the modernization of equipment, skills, and tactics affects the possibility of winning a battle? God bless and mabuhay.